Hi, everyone. So, welcome to chapter 10. So, just to contextualize this lecture, we only have two quizzes left for the second half of our 99.1. So, like what you mentioned, there are only three major topics, right? So, we're done with cash, we're done with receivables, and then the final chunk will be about property, plant, and equipment. So, for today, we're gonna be taking on PPE part 1. And then next week, we'll have the second part of property, plant, and equipment. And then finally, Christmas break, and then our final exam. So for today, we're really just going to be focusing on taking a deep dive on how do we actually account for property, plant, and equipment, or better known as PPE. So going to our lecture overview, again, we're just going to be following the similar BAA formula, right? So number one, we first have to broaden our understanding. So in terms of learning objective one, we have to understand what are the different assets under long-term assets kasi si PPE is just one major chunk. And then from there, we want to take an overview on what is PPE, what are its characteristics, and what does accounting for it look like. And then from there, we're gonna take a deep dive on how to properly account for it. So this is gonna be actually the chunk of today's presentation. So we're gonna be looking at the initial recognition, the subsequent recognition, particularly ano ba yung methods of depreciation. So if I had to be honest, if there's one thing that we really have to master for PPE, it would be depreciation. So similarly, from like yung mga notes receivable na calculating interest was the major challenge for us. For PPE naman, the major challenge would be how do you actually master how to record for the depreciation. And then finally, after knowing initial and subsequent recognition, the last learning objective for that would be disposal. And then at the end, we're just gonna quickly summarize everything by analyzing it through the lens of the financial statement. So now that everything's aligned, let's first take a look at an overview of what are long-term assets. In essence, yung non-current assets, there are four major assets under this. So you have your property, plant, and equipment, or your PPE. You have your investment property, and then you have your intangible assets and mineral resources. So PPE part 1, which would be the coverage of your quiz 4 for your second part, would really focus on property, plant, and equipment. And then for next week, that's when we're gonna be mastering intangible assets and mineral resources. However, honestly, when it comes to everything in terms of long-term assets, particularly for property, plant, equipment, and mineral resources, medyo pareho lang naman yung accounting nila. So ang crucial talaga sa atin for this PPE portion is that we master today's lecture and also yung exercises for this week. So as you can see, under each major asset class, there are also some other classifications. So under intangible assets, you have your patents, your copyright, your trademark, and the like. And then today, we're gonna be taking a deep dive in fully understanding ano ba yung, how do you differentiate between land improvement, building, and equipment. So without further ado, out of all of these four, we're gonna be focusing on property, plant, and equipment. So before we go to the accounting for it, ang pinaka-importante is that we understand the underlying business context for property, plant, and equipment. And like with other accounting concepts and accounting subjects, the very first thing that we have to do is what are the major characteristics of PPE? Well, based on PAS 16, PPE or property, plant, and equipment are what we call tangible assets. Tangible meaning meron siya lang physical substance na hawakan natin siya. And in terms of use, it's held for use in terms of production and it is expected to be used for more than one period. So in order to simplify this, there are three major characteristics of our PPE. And basically how we can remember it is through tons, right? So T, it's a tangible asset, meaning that it's a resource and it has a physical substance. Second would be O, or it's used in operations of business and it's held for use either for production, either to supply of goods or services, or for admin purposes, right? So T is tangible assets, O is used in operations, and then finally the last one is NS. It's not intended for sale. So ang number one important dito is that your PPE should not be intended for sale. Why? Because If it's held for sale, it should be categorized as an investment property. So again, there's a big difference between property, plant, and equipment and investment property. What we're going to be focusing on for today's lecture is PPE, but in order to make sure na we are able to properly define it, we have to distinguish it against an investment property. So the second thing that we have to discuss is, ano nga ba ang investment property, right? So investment property are still properties, particularly land, building, or both. But in terms of its usage, dalawa lang yan. It's either used to it's held for rental, so HR, meaning that the owner or the lessee will hold on to a land, and then the reason why they're holding on to that land or building or condominium is that they want some people to lease it, right, or rent it. And therefore, yung primary use niya is, okay, I own this land and then I want to earn income from the rentals. Another aspect of this would be capital appreciation, meaning, pare, you buy a condo now, let's say in near Katipunan, right? And then in the next 5 years, I anticipate na, a lot of people would want to still study in Ateneo and UP, etc., etc. There will be bigger facilities, there would be a new mall, etc., etc. in the area. So you expect that the price of that condo will appreciate, right? And therefore, hindi mo naman siya binili for your operating of your business. Primarily, you just want to sell it at a higher price, right? So again, as the name suggests, investment property is not held for operations. It's primarily held to generate income directly, right? So again, another example, Clark is actually expected to be like one of the major cities in the next 5 years. So if I buy land, even though I have a business in terms of like operating, like creating paper, if I buy land but I don't use that land to have a factory for paper, but instead I just hold the land and then I expect in 5 years it will appreciate by 10 million, let's say. Rather than categorizing that land as PPE, it should be categorized as investment property, right? So next example, I have a printing shop, right? And I do my printing shop primarily in our house in order to produce, right? And then I buy a condo. Now that condo, if I transfer my business to that condo and then I use that as my office so that I can print paper, that condo will be a PPE or a property plant equipment. However, if I buy a condo, I'm still running my businesses at home, and then pinarent out ko siya to a friend, my main source of income for that particular property is rentals. So I get monthly revenue from rent. Therefore, in terms of my financial statements, that condominium would be classified as investment property, not PPE, right? So again, just for simplification's sake, in order to properly classify, PPE should be used for operations, and then investment property is for generating income directly. So either through rental, HR, or CA, capital appreciation. So again, to summarize, PPE are tangible assets held for use in production, and it's expected to be used for more than one period. So the three characteristics would be tons, right? T, it's tangible. O, used in operations, held for use. And third, and super important, it's not intended for sale, right? So, okay, we're clear na on the strict definition and characteristics of PPE. The next thing that we have to know is how do you actually account for it, right? And I think medyo nasasanay naman na kayo here because pareho lang naman yung format, right? In cash and receivables, right? So the recording process for PPE can still be broken down into three major phases. And this is gonna be the overview lang of today's lecture. First would be initial recognition. So one of the key things na I want you to master would be classification. What accounts do we classify under land? What accounts should we classify as land improvement, building equipment, etc., etc. And then, aside from that, ang pamatay na topic or mahirap na topic here is lump sum purchase. So we'll go into that, right? So that's initial recognition. Moving forward, so subsequent measurement, the things that we have to know would be, number one, methods of depreciation. Under chapter 3, we already quickly touched upon what depreciation is. But now we're gonna take a deep dive. And again, ito yung pamatay for PPE. If nalilito kayo sa depreciation, this is something that you need to master. So, for those that are using Valix, PPE, topics are very comprehensive, right? So, I urge you to really master all relevant topics in terms of PPE, and definitely for Vagrant users also. But for PPE, very helpful would be land and building basic problems, land and building comprehensive problems, depreciation straight line method, and depreciation change and useful life in method, right? And depreciation declining balance. So if you have the time, I really suggest that you master all of these subtopics, right? So aside from this, I just want you to have a good theory or foundation in terms of capital expenditures and ordinary repairs. And then finally sa disposal, pare-pareho lang sila but there are different modes. Retirement, sale, and exchange, right? So again, very similar to cash, very similar to receivables. But in essence, it can be broken down to initial recognition, subsequent measurement, and then finally disposal. And honestly, I want the greatest takeaway that I want you to remember for today's lecture is that initial recognition, all property, plant, and equipment are measured at cost at the point of purchase. So initial recognition, it will be recorded at cost. However, in the next few months, in the next few periods, subsequently, we always measure PPE at net PPE, meaning it's the cost minus accumulated depreciation or ACDEP minus accumulated impairment or AC impairment, and then adding any capital expenditure. So don't worry, we'll talk about each of these later, but I want you to remember, initial recognition of PPE is at cost, pero next time that it's reported in the financial statement, it should be measured at net PPE, which is basically cost minus ACDEP minus AC impairment, and then adding any capital expenditures. So in essence, in terms of recognition, how would that work? So for example, bumili ako ng iPhone 12, right? iPhone 12 Pro, whatever. So in essence, I would recognize this at cost. So debit equipment, credit cash for 60,000, right? Now, after 1 year, syempre ginagamit ko yan all the time, like for Instagram, TikTok, BeReal, whatever. And then syempre medyo nahuhulog-hulog ko yan, nababasa, nalagyan ng pagkain. So I'll try to resell it. Now, syempre, if you have any experience trying to resell your phones, even if you bought it at 60,000, probably mabibenta mo na lang yan after 1 year at 40,000, right? And the reason behind that is that in essence, once you use it, parang the more you use something, bumababa yung value niya because it's not brand new. And that's, in essence, the idea behind depreciation. That your cash actually depreciated in value because of its usage. Parang mas mabagal na siya, mas marumi na siya, mas marami na siyang cracks. And therefore, while we're using it, one of the key events would be to recognize depreciation, which is debit depreciation expense, credit ACDEP of 20,000. So, in essence, initial recognition natin is at cost of 60,000, but subsequently, after 1 year, we represent it at net PPE at 40,000. But then again, I want you to remember, I always highlighted this ever since chapter 3, that in terms of presentation, the equipment will still be reflected at cost at 60,000. Pero we still have a balance sheet item called, or the contra asset account of accumulated depreciation of 20,000. So yung net PPE is 40,000. So even though I say that's gonna be presented at net PPE, in the formal statement of the financial statement, it will still be equipment less ACDEP is equal to net PPE of 40,000. So in essence, that's basically it. Madali lang journal entries in property, plant, and equipment. Ang mahirap dito talaga would really be how do you compute for your depreciation and how do you classify certain items, right? So without further ado, let's take a deep dive in each of the stage of accounting process, particularly or starting with the initial recognition. So in terms of short probs, one of the things that I want you to master is classifying PPE. This one, ito yung mga parang pampataas nyo ng points because this is more about familiarity and understanding. So, please master this kasi sometimes pwede rin mag-chain yung problem. And if you incorrectly classify a PPE, like land siya, pero building pala dapat, or etc., then mag-chain yung answers. And therefore, the very first thing that you have to master would be classifying PPE. So if you want to have more experiences in classifying PPE, answer more exercises, both in Waygunt and Valix. Kaya the two chapters in Valix na you can look into would be land and building basic problems, land and building comprehensive problems. But more importantly than that, ang kailangan nyo talagang ma-memorize would be, given this line item, how can I tell if it's land, building, others, right? So for this particular section, that's what we're gonna be focusing on, right? So classifying our property, plant, and equipment accounts. And simply, your PPE can be broken down into 4 types, right? So you have your land improvements, your buildings, and your equipment. So 4. So let's first focus on land. So ang land is basically, again, just for it to be categorized as PPE, it should always be used for operations, either as a manufacturing plant or an office site. Now, we record land at cost, right? And what are the components of cost? All of these things, lahat ng costs of these would be added to the value of land. Meaning, sa purchase price, we have to include stamp taxes, title guarantee insurance, option fees, regardless of exercised or not. Aside from that, mga settlement cost. Pag may nakita kayong escrow fees, title fees for any sort of reason, like for investigation, conveyance, this should be included in the value of land. If you paid a lawyer or any legal fees with regards to the land, then you should also include it. Commission of your real estate agents. If you have accrued property taxes or liens assumed by the purchaser, kailangan kasama rin yan. So some clue words would be taxes and arrears, land mortgage, delinquent property, etc., etc. And then all other necessary costs in order to bring it to its intended purpose. So grading, leveling, landfill, so pag tinatabunan nyo so that mag-even out, etc., etc., still included in the value of land. Clearing of trees, kasama. So, kaya you spend 50,000 in clearing of trees, then that should be included in the cost. But you have to subtract pag may nabenta kayong timber or gravel sold. So, for example, my current cost of land is around 1 million. If I cleared trees and spent an additional 100,000, my land value should be 1.1 million. But if I was able to sell yung wood na kinuha ko from clearing the trees as timber, and I earned like, let's say, 50,000, now my value of land is 1 million plus the 100,000 cost of clearing the tree minus the 50 na I got back. So now it's 1,050,000 pesos yung land, right? And then finally, land survey and assessment, right? So the reason why dinamihan ko na to is so that every time you see any of these mentioned, automatic or ma-associate nyo siya to land. Now, maraming pamatay dito if hindi nyo na-memorize. So I'm not telling you naman to memorize it, pero please familiarize yourself about it by answering a lot of exercises. So meaning, for example, every time you see grading, leveling, landfill, automatic land survey, land, right? Clearing of trees, land. Hindi yun building, hindi yun land improvement. Land yung grading, leveling, landfill, clearing of trees, etc., etc., right? So the reason why it's important to distinguish one PPE class from another is that unlike land improvements, unlike buildings, unlike equipment, land does not depreciate. So it never depreciates, right? So if you have other friends into finance or you have brothers, sisters, etc., etc., and then they ask you, what's the best investment? A lot of people would have a theory na, aside from the stock exchange and whatever, they'll tell you, if you have the money, buy land because it never depreciates. Meaning, if bumili ka ng land now at like 7 million, next year, tataas naman yung, or mag-appreciate yung value ng land. And therefore, one of the key things that I want you to remember is that land does not depreciate, right? So that's basically land. So again, please master all of the costs associated to land. Now, going on to the second type, we have land improvements. Now, ito yung nako-confused between land and land improvements. The difference between land and land improvements is that land improvements, meron kang structural additions on top of the land, right? So, basically, you have to include all necessary costs to make the improvements for intended use. So, if driveways, car spaces, fences, pag may landscaping ka na, sewage systems, sidewalks, pavements, underground sprinklers, all of these are structural additions. Compared to like, nag-landfill ka lang, nag-grade ka lang, nag-land survey ka lang, ina-assess mo lang yung land, right? But ito, nagtayo ka talaga ng driveway, nagtayo ka talaga ng fence, gumawa ka talaga ng landscape, merong physical structures. And therefore, instead of categorizing those as land, it should be properly categorized as land improvement. So again, every time you see any of these terms, please make sure that you categorize it as land improvements. So let's look at an example. Honestly, in terms of these question types, ang gagawin sa inyo is lulunurin kayo ng information, right? Wherein, let's say, the following were incurred by Rosenberg Construction in purchasing the land. So in total, they spent around 2.7 million. And then 2.7 million were broken down into all of these things. Now, the common questions here would be, what is the value of land? What is the value of land improvement? So honestly, it's all about mastering the categorization of these costs. So you go back to your definition of land improvement and your land, and then kung ano yung associated with that type of PPE, that's where you categorize the cost. So let's start. You have 1.7 million na cash price. So this one, cash price related to buying the land. So you categorize it under land. Yung accrued taxes are taxes in arrears that you shouldered raw. So 140,000, so land pa rin. Next, you have a sewage system. So sewage system is a structural addition. Nagkaroon ka ng pipes pang clear ng water. So may actual addition. And therefore, that should be land improvement. What about real estate broker commission? So syempre, in order for you to properly buy that land, you needed the help of a real estate broker. So under land yan. Okay, fencing and installation of light posts. So naglagay ka rin ng fence, nagpailaw ka for the property. So yan is a structural addition. So it's a land improvement. So taxes in arrears on the property, again, is land. Pavements, again, structural addition. Okay, land survey. Land survey, meaning inassess mo lang or pinastudy mo lang yung land. There are no structural additions in a land survey, and therefore, that would fall under land. Assessment, same thing. Landscaping. So yung landscaping, nagplant ka ng trees, nagpa-cut ka ng shrubs para it looks beautiful. These are structural additions. And therefore, this is land improvement. Clearing and grading. So pinaklear mo lang yung lupa, therefore that's land. And then last two would be attorney fees and escrow fees, which are associated to land. So now that you're done categorizing, then it's just a matter of adding. So if you add all of these, you will arrive at 2.08 million in land and 678 in land improvement. So basically, just to double check, we just add. So 2085. So this is our value of land plus our land improvements, 2.7 million, right? And correct. So basically, with this amount of costs, we were able to properly categorize them from land to land improvement, right? So now we have land and land improvement. So yung journal entry lang natin would be, we credit cash of 2.7 and then debit land to 2.085 million and 678,000 of land improvement, right? So I hope clear so far. So any questions, so kindly pause the video, comment on YouTube if you have any questions for this particular part. Just kindly include the timestamp and then I can answer it. Or you can comment also on Facebook, right? Okay. So we're clear now with land. We're clear now with land improvements. Now, let's go to buildings, right? So buildings should also be used for operations. Now, the complication lang between buildings is that either you purchase it or you construct it, right? So sa purchase, actually, pareho lang siya naman with land. Like may stamp taxes pa rin, pero syempre dapat associated with building, attorney and escrow fees, real estate agents and brokers, and yung property tax. Yung other terms lang that are associated with buildings under the necessary cost to make it for its intended purpose. Pag may nakita kayong remodeling, replacing or repairing roof, flooring, electrical wiring, and plumbing, all of those should be associated to building. Again, remodeling, replacing, repairing roof, floors, electrical wiring, and plumbing, all are associated with building purchases, right? Now, the second complication is, what if bumili ka ng land and nag-construct ka ng building? So, all of those construction costs should be attributed to building, syempre. So now, I want you to familiarize yourself and honestly, ideally, master what are the terms associated to constructing building. So yung iba gets naman. Contract price of building the building, like with the raw materials and whatnot. That's building. Architect fees, plans and specifications, meaning yung mga blueprint, etc. Payment to building contractor, kasama yan sa building cost. Sometimes, or every time, magbabayad ka rin sa government. So, for building permit or any payments to the city. Another thing, magpapa-excavate ka. So, yung grading, clearing, landfill, all land. Pero excavation is associated to building. Another thing na palagi lumalabas, may interest expense ka or borrowing cost to finance the project. So, kare, mahal magpatay ng building. Like, probably need like 80 million at least. So, syempre, you know, if you're an individual, probably wala ka namang 80 million. So, sometimes you'll borrow money and the interest on that borrowing should be capitalized to your building. So, interest expense to any finance project, kailangan part siya ng building. Ito yung mahirap. Malilito kayo kung pare nagsabi sila, gumawa sila ng temporary building or temporary house. You'd think, oh, land improvement yan. Kasi may structural addition. Pero yung temporary building na yon, pare, nagpatuyo ka ng bahay, right? Gagawa sila ng nipa hut. Yung nipa hut na yon, hindi naman land improvement yon. That nipa hut was constructed to build the building or to build the house. Therefore, temporary buildings, temporary quarters for crew should be associated to building costs. They're not land improvements. Ano pa? Land improvements, we said fencing and light posts, right? Fencing and light posts. Pero if it's a safety fence around the site or the removal of it, that's building. Kasi the fence was primarily a temporary fence for the construction. So ingat, safety fence around site is building, not land improvement. Any inspection or liability insurance related to the construction should also be part of the building. So again, same thing na I'm requesting you. Please familiarize yourself with all the terms related to valuation of the building, be it whether it's purchased or it's constructed. So let's look at an example. So, gawin natin mas complicated. Gumastos ka raw ng, or si Rosenberg, or si Greendale community, spent over 1.67 million. Then, you have different breakdowns of the cost. Now, it's asking you, what is the value of land, what is the value of land improvement, and what is the value of the building? So, number one, architect. Oh, so architect, so may pinagawa ka. So that's basically building. Next, Land survey. We already know this. Land survey is under land. Grading and filling. Okay, grading and filling, land rin. But excavation, again, excavation, building. Next, building permit. Building permit. For building permit, syempre, building. Landscaping. Okay, land. Ano bang landscaping? Is it land or land improvements? Well, landscaping, ang iniisip ko, palagi silang gumagawa ng shrubs and mga parang courtyard or whatever. That's a structural addition. Therefore, landscaping should be land improvement. Safety fence. Okay. Safety fence around site. So, ginawa yung fence para walang mahulugan. Right? Therefore, that's primarily a building. Pavement should be what? Land improvement. Kasi it's a structural addition. Right? So, it's a land improvement. Pavements. Temporary building. Building. Clearing of trees. Again, pag nagpa-clear ka ng trees, that's just to make the land intended for use. So, land. Interest cost during construction, naghumiram siya ng pera, but that borrowing cost should be capitalized under building. And then insurance premium on the site is building. So if you add all three together, you'll have land, 145,000, land improvement at 55,000, and 1.47 million for building. So again, ganun lang, right? And then to double check, you just add all of this and then it should be equal to 1.67 million. So at the end of your analysis, you'll be able to find the different classifications. So the journal entry is basically credit cash of 1.67 million, debit land of 145,000, debit land improvement of 55,000, and debit building of 1.47 million, right? So again, if you have any questions when it comes to classifications or any terms related to building, land improvement, land, feel free to comment on the YouTube video. So yung last is yung equipment. Now sa equipment, unlike building, land improvements, and land, equipments, medyo obvious naman what are equipments. Car, right? Computer, machinery, all of those are equipments. Now, the questions of equipments is there are certain costs na you have to outright expense, and then there are certain costs na you capitalize. You will hear a lot of the term capitalize. When I say capitalize, that means i-add mo siya sa value of equipment, and that will mean that cost will be part of your asset. Pero if it's outright expense, then it's an expense. So again, pag capitalize, you will add it to the value of the equipment as an asset. But if it's outright expense, then it's maintenance expense, repair expense. Automatic outflow yon of the benefits, right? So again, the problem naman with equipment would be, do you capitalize the cost or do you treat it as an outright expense? Now, for equipment, you should capitalize all costs, all necessary costs to bring the equipment for intended use. So please, again, master all of these terms. So syempre, yung cash purchase price mo alongside the sales tax. Second, your freight charge, you include also. Third, insurance during transit. So number one, it has to be during transit and it should be paid by the purchaser. Insurance after mo ma-install would be outright expense. So ingat. Pag insurance, kailangan during transit lang and paid by the purchaser. Pag may nakita kayo na parang ginagawa sa equipment when you bring it, like assembling, pinuntrahan, niletter, all of those are capitalized. Installing or reinstallment, capitalized. When you test kung gumagana ba yung unit, or you dismantle it because of some particular reason at the current location, all of these are still capitalized. Other things, so nandun na. You refurbish the machine, you add safety rails and platform around it para hindi masira. You include like a water device for cooling, or in-adjust mo, or prepare mo yung site, or nag-hire ka ng outside consultant on how to use the device. All of those are costs to bring the machine for its intended use. And all of these costs mentioned in this slide should be capitalized. right? On the other hand, any annual recurring expenditures are outright expensed. So automatically, pag may nakita kayong motor vehicle registration, insurance after installation, or ordinary repairs, all of those are outright expensed, right? So let's look at an example para clear. So unlike building, unlike land improvement, bibigyan kayo ng total costs. But ang question kay equipment is, should you expense it or should you add it to the value of equipment? Right? So some expenses are accrued. So just be careful about that. So, correct, purchase price, alam natin equipment yan. Sales tax related to the purchase, equipment. Insurance during transit. Okay, during transit, equipment. Annual insurance policy. Yan, ito recurring expenditure. So this should be expense. Motor vehicle license, well, sabi nila, expense rin natin. Delivery cost, to bring it to the destination, that is freight charge, equipment. Painting and lettering, so pinaganda, equipment. Ordinary repairs or annual expenditures. And then water device to cool it down, equipment. So we have 515,500 for equipment and 284,000 in expenses and accruals. So if journal entry natin yan, credit cash of 799.5 thousand, and then debit equipment 515, debit prepaid insurance for your annual insurance of 220, debit taxes and licenses if it's motor vehicle and registration, and then yung ordinary repairs of 52,000 you debit for repair expenses. So again, for machinery and for equipment, ang tanong lang naman is, do you capitalize or do you outright expense, right? So to summarize, all PPE types are initially recognized at cost, right? Consistent naman yan. Now, ang kailangan nyo lang i-master is, ano ba yung mga costs associated to each, right? So, leveling, grading, clearing of trees, land survey, assessment sa land improvement, driveways, right? Ano pa? Fences na hindi for safety, light posts, right? Driveway, parking, pavements, land improvement. Building, excavation, borrowing cost, interest, temporary buildings, building. Equipment, purchase price, lettering, assembling, painting. So dapat alam niyo yan. So parang huwag kayo matakot, usually ibobombard kayo ng maraming line items. It's all about just knowing how to classify each. And again, mastery will come either number 1, memorize yung slides na I gave here, or number 2, you answer a lot of exercises, both in Waygunt and in Vadex. So please, I'll leave it up to you. Ito yung pinakamadali to rack up points kasi it's just classification. So please, let's be an expert at that, right? So that's the first mastery. Now, the second thing that we have to master for today is that ang pamatay sa classification is what you call lump sum purchases. Meaning, kware, usually naman, pag bumibili ka ng land, sometimes meron ng bahay doon or building, right? Parang pinaglumaan, etc., etc. So what if nagbayad ka ng, let's say, 1 million and then kasama na si land and then merong old building. So how do we treat? Is it yung 1 million land or 1 million building? Or i-divide ba natin by 2, like 500,000 land, 500,000 building? Medyo magulo, right? So now, there is actually a PIC issuance on the land and building issue, right? And to really illustrate this, let's have a concrete example alongside the theory. So this is the general theory, pero madali i-imagine with example. The first thing you ask yourself if it's a lump sum purchase is the building usable? If the old building is no longer usable, you capitalize all of the costs to land. So meaning, in this example, our lump sum price is 1 million, right? That whole 1 million will be included in land. So 1 million land. However, if it's usable, and it will be used, meaning hindi mo siya i-demolish today, hindi mo siya i-demolish anytime in the future, then we have to allocate the value of the price sa land and building based on their what? Fair value. Again, fair value. When you allocate, you use the fair value. In some of the examples, in some of the exercises, lulutuhin kayo. Bibigyan kayo ng cost of building. Bibigyan kayo ng cost of land. But you cannot allocate using the cost of building or cost of land. You have to allocate based on fair value, right? So meaning, kwari, yung fair value of land is 1 million and the fair value of building is 3 million. Let's say. Huwag kayong malito. You can't write it na land 1 million, building 3 million. Eh, ang ginastos nyo lang is 1 million. What you have to do is to get the proportion, right? Kasi, what is 1 million? So, the first step is i-add nyo. So, 1 million yung fair value ni land, then 3 million yung fair value ni building. So, total 4 million. So, 1 million divided by 4, yung ratio niya is land is 25%, building is 75%. Therefore, you get the lump sum price of 1 million times 0.25% or 25%. So, yung value of land ko is 250,000 while the value of my building is 1 million times 0.75. Right? Or 750. So, with a 1 million lump sum, step 1 is the building usable. If it is, then we have to allocate based on fair value. So, 25% of the cost will go to land. So, ang value ng land ko is debit land, 250,000. Debit building, 750,000. Credit, 1 million. Right? So, yung second scenario is if it's no longer usable, capitalize everything to land. And then, usually, pag no longer usable, pinapa-demolish mo yung building. So, demolition cost, less the salvage cost, meaning, I spent 350 pesos, 350,000, oy, gibain nyo yung old building, gusto ko gamitin yung land. And then, out of the rubble, binenta mo yung wood, binenta mo yung concrete na nakuha nyo for 50,000. So, tumubo ka ng 50, pero gumastos ka ng 350,000. So, yung total cost of your land would be 1 million plus your demolition cost of 350,000 kasi that demolition cost is part of the cost intended na cost you incurred to make it into your intended use. So, plus 350 pero subtract yung 50,000 na kinita mo by selling the materials, right? So, that's the salvage cost. So, 1 million plus 350 minus 50, yung land is 1.3 million. So, super important to master lump sum purchases, right? So, this is medyo simpler pa nga eh. So, this is scenario 1 or iteration 1. It's a lump sum price and then wala nang and then tinatanong lang sa inyo is the building usable? If it's usable, you allocate sa land and building. But if it's no longer usable, you capitalize sa land. Now, the second complication is, what if you intend to demolish the old building right away? So now, let's look at usable old building, but it's demolished immediately. Let's get a new example. Let's say the cost of that old building is 100,000. You have a construction cost of your new building. So after ng old building, pinagiba mo, and then magpapatayo ka ng new building worth 900,000. And then para pagibain yon, you had a demolition cost of 50,000 and then nakabenta ka ng materials at 10,000. So now, how much is your new building? Now, the valuation of that new building depends on how you categorize it. Some companies will treat it as a PPE or investment property. But some companies will treat it as inventory. Kasi paano kung real estate developers or whatnot, whatever. So, how do you treat it? And what's gonna be the value of the building? If scenario 1, you categorize it as PPE or investment property, what you have to include would be the construction cost of the 900,000 of the building plus the demolition cost minus the salvage cost. So, yung building mo is 940,000. And then yung cost of your old building na dinemolish mo is a loss of 100,000. Okay? So again, you ask yourself, how do you classify the new building? If the new building will be classified as PPE or investment property, then it's gonna be the building is at 940,000 and a loss of 100,000. However, if it's an inventory, right? You classify the new building as inventory. Yes, i-add natin yung construction cost, yung demolition cost, and then net salvage cost. But the cost of old building would be added to your inventory valuation of that building. So now here, if you categorize it as inventory, your inventory will have 1.040,000. Instead of treating the 100,000 of the cost of old building as a loss, you will treat it as part of the cost of the new building. So yun lang yung difference. Yung difference lang is how do you treat the cost of old building? And in order for you to understand how to treat the cost, you ask yourself, how will you classify the new building? If it's PPE investment property, it's a loss. But if it's classified as inventory, then it's added to the cost of the new building. Right? So ito yung scenario na sinabi natin. Right? Ito yun. So I already explained this to you. The second is, what if yung old building is used as PPE pero in a subsequent period? Meaning, let's say 2022 ngayon. I will demolish it 2023. So what do I do? Right? So the demolition cost less the salvage value is capitalized as part of the new building cost. And then if may pinaalis akong tenant or squatter in that building, we have to capitalize it as part of the new building cost. So again, this is more of understanding lang. How do you treat the certain costs when it comes to lump sum purchase? So any questions? Usually ito yung pinakamagulo. But please understand this lang using this example, right? So we're done with initial recognition or classifying PPE. Again, it's very straightforward. Ang trabaho niya lang talaga is please master the terms. Ang pinakamasakit na mistakes would be, alam niyo lahat ng terms tapos meron lang isa kayong hindi alam. So, kuwari, na misclassify niyo siya. Edi 4 points na yon kasi mali yung pag-classify niyo. So, mali na yung land niyo and mali na yung building niyo, right? Kuwari, na dapat yung item na to land pala, pero nilagay niyo sa building. Edi may difference na yung land at saka yung building niyo. So, please, for easy points, please master classification of PPE, right? Next. The next hardest is subsequent recognition. Now, in your deferrals and accruals, medyo may taste naman na kayo on how to depreciate. Pero, yung level of complexity na to, you have to expect it to be in the same level of complexity as your notes receivable. Na, I will teach you the concept, pero wag kayong matakot if biglang binutas-butas yung mga given. You have to be able to understand the whole process, and then you have to understand how to solve backwards. As much as possible, dinamihan ko na yung examples here. But please go to Valex or your Waygun and then answer anything you can find when it comes to your depreciation. Depreciation yung dadali sa inyo sa PPE. I promise you. So, if you want to do well on PPE, the thing you have to master would be depreciation. With that said, we go back to subsequent recognition. We already know that initially, we recognize PPE at cost. Now, yung subsequent recognition of your should be measured at net PPE. And net PPE is just basically your cost less accumulated depreciation less accumulated impairment. Now, I'll just quickly touch upon impairment kasi this is really more about theory and 99.2 naman yung parang maraming impairment problems. But the only thing that I want you to know about impairment is that the PPE must not be carried at more than the recoverable amount. Meaning, ito yung cost ng PPE nyo. And then, ito yung recoverable amount. Meaning, if I have a cost of, let's say, 10 million, and then I can only recover the amount of 7 million, I need to recognize an impairment loss of 3 million. Kasi, ang pwede ko na lang may recover dun is 7 million eh. So, 10 million minus 7 million is 3 million. So, kaya, that would probably be an accumulated impairment, right? So, impairment loss, accumulated impairment. So, again, Net PPE is cost less accumulated depreciation less impairment. Yung depreciation, so that's basically it. I will never talk about impairment again, but please understand na the PPE must not be carried at more than the recoverable amount. The one that we'll focus on for today would be your depreciation. So the depreciation is basically, again, usually when you buy land, when you buy building, when you buy like a computer, malaki yung gastos nyo in millions. And as we learned in accrual, those millions that you spend should not be outright expensed. Rather, we capitalize it as an asset, and then year on year, let's just allocate a portion of expenses of its depreciable amount over its useful life. Meaning, a portion of that asset, i-depreciate natin every year or every period. So that unti-unti bumababa, nagiging expense na yung gastos natin, right? And in order to track those changes, we accumulate that depreciation so that every period we have your net PPE. So please understand na the number one formula for this is cost minus accumulated depreciation is equal to your net PPE, and that would be your carrying amount. So in a lot of exercises, ang itatanong sa inyo is, what would be the carrying amount of this property at year 3? What would be the carrying amount at year 7? Ganun. And in essence, pag tinanong nyo sa yung carrying amount, you just have to ask yourself two things. What's the cost? What's the accumulated depreciation at that period? And then I subtract ACDEP from cost, and I will get my net PPE or my carrying amount for that year. Right? So, yung cost will never change. But your ACDEP will change year on year. Kasi every time you recognize a depreciation expense, tataas ng tataas yung accumulated depreciation. Right? But in essence, again, I'll repeat, in your problems, in your exercises, tatanungin lang sa inyo, what would be the carrying amount in year 7? All I have to do is, okay, what's the cost of my equipment? What is my accumulated depreciation on year 7? So, cost minus the ACDEP in year 7 is equal to my carrying amount in year 7. Ganun lang. Now, the complication is, how do you solve for your ACDEP, right? Right? So, the question is, how do we depreciate properties? And honestly, one, let's have an overview of depreciation. I want you to master what are the important terms in depreciation. And then, after gets you yung the whole concept of depreciation, let's look at the 3 ways of solving. Particularly straight line depreciation, which is the one we learned in accruals. Then we'll have declining balance, either double or 150% or whatever. And then third would be units of activity, right? So let's go muna on the overview of depreciation. So for depreciation, the first term na I want you to understand is cost. So cost, like what we mentioned in initial recognition, is that PPE are classified as assets instead of outright expense because we expect those equipments, those land, to produce benefit. So if I spent $1,300 on, let's say, a computer, that cost will be PPE, debit PPE 1,300, credit cash of 1,300. So clear tayo with the first term, cost. Next, there is this thing called useful life. Now, useful life can be in terms of years, can be in terms of units of activity. But in essence, pag bumili ako ng computer, there's an assumption on how long will that computer last that will produce its benefit. So let's say the usual is that it probably has a 4-year useful life, meaning from now until 4 years, that's the amount of time na expected to have use or to produce benefits for me. And therefore, yung 1.3 million, what I can expect is that I can break it down into 4 periods. Year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. And the idea is that I will slowly recognize a portion of the 1.3 million as outright expenses for each of the periods. So ina-allocate ko yung depreciation expense niya year in, year out, depending on your useful life. So pare ito, 4 years kaya 4. If it's 8 years, divide by 8. If it's 12 years, it's divide by 12. If it's, pare, the useful life is based on total machine hours. Kaya a computer will last like 100 hours. So ito, i-divide ko yan by the number of hours, etc. etc. Right? So that's cost. Alam natin yung cost, alam natin yung useful life. The third term I want you to know is salvage value. So salvage value or residual value, or RV for short, is our estimate of our assets disposal value net disposable cost. So basically, the salvage value or residual value is the value at the end of useful life. So let's say, at the end of 4 years, I expect na pwede ko pa naman ibenta yung computer ko at $300. Meaning, a portion of it will definitely be expensed. Pero $300 out of the 1,300, I can probably sell at $300. Meaning, I have a residual value or a salvage value that at the end of the useful life, which in this case is 4 years, I can still sell it at $300. Meaning, $300 pwede ko pang bawiin. Therefore, ang i-allocate ko na lang na cost is 1,000. Right? Kasi $300 out of the 1,300 pwede ko pang ibenta at the end. So I have probably 1,000 na I have to allocate out of these 4 periods. And that is what you call your depreciable amount. Basically, that's the portion of your cost that we need to depreciate. And mathematically, whenever I ask you for your depreciable amount, it's 1,300 minus the residual value of 300 kasi pwede mo pa siyang ibenta eh. So 1,000 yung hindi mo na talaga pwedeng ibenta. And that 1,000 should be allocated in your useful life. So meaning if I have 1,000 na I have to recognize as an expense for the 4 years, I need to recognize, divide by 4, 250 depreciation expense year in, year out. So itong 1.3 na asset ko, eventually through the depreciation method, a portion of it, called the depreciable amount, is allocated across different periods. So 250 per year. And then yung 300 na pwede ko pang bawiin is what we call the residual value or your salvage value. So please understand these 4 terms. So yung cost is your value of your PPE. Your useful life is your method of allocating your depreciation, either in terms of units or time or activity. Your salvage value is the value that your PPE should be at the end of the useful life. So after 4 years, the residual value is 300, right? So I can sell it for 300. And yung depreciable amount, which is just basically cost minus residual value, or 1,300 minus 300, is your depreciable amount, which is 1,000. Okay? So now, we go to the first method of depreciation. In order to solve for your depreciation expense, usually your annual depreciation expense, it's just basically depreciation amount divided by the useful life in years equal to your annual depreciation expense. So again, in that example, our depreciable amount is 1,000 because that's 1,300 cost minus salvage value of 300 is equal to DA of 1,000. Our useful life was in years. So 4 years, so 1,000 divided by 4 years, we have a depreciation expense of 250 per year. So how does that look like? So you'll have a table, and in this table, you'll have your cost, you have your depreciation expense, your AC debt, and your carrying amount. And then in year 1, ito yung kailangan natin i-solve, year 2, year 3, and year 4. And then at the end, meron tayong, ito yung itsura niya sa balance sheet. So this is the only time I will use cost in this column, just because I want to highlight na in your financial statements, regardless of your depreciation method, your equipment should always be at cost at 1.3, and then you have another line item at less accumulated depreciation. And then when you subtract both, you'll get your carrying amount. So right now, we're at our year 0 or your purchase date. In your purchase date, it's gonna be equipment carrying amount 1,300. Now let's look at year 1. So nagkaroon na ng usage. So in the next 4 years, our cost will remain the same. It's 1,300. Now, how do you answer the depreciation expense? We know kanina na your depreciation expense is calculated as follows. You start with your cost at 1,300. You subtract your 300 residual value. You get 1,000 in your depreciable amount. Yung 1,000 depreciable amount, divide mo by the useful life of 4 years. So we expect a depreciation expense of 250. So in year 1, we expect a depreciation of expense of 250, and your ACDEP is just your accumulated depreciation, or it just takes note how many times, ano ba yung total depreciation expense for that particular product. So since wala pa naman tayong DepX before, then the ACDEP is still 250,000. Ay, 250. Therefore, your carrying amount is 1,050 because that's 1,300 minus 250, 150. So in year 1, this is what it will look like. Now, you have an ACDEP of 250 and a carrying amount of 1,050. Pero your equipment is still at 1,300. We go to year 2, still same annual depreciation expense, pero ACDEP is now what? 250 from the previous year plus the current year of 250. Your ACDEP should now be at 500. And therefore, 1,300 minus your ACDEP on year 2 of 500, it's an 800 carrying amount. So in year 2, your financial statement would look like this. Equipment of 1,300, ACDEP of 500, carrying amount of 800. Yet, so sometimes, all you have to do is solve for your ACDEP to get your carrying amount for that particular year. Year 3, again, same depreciation expense of 250 per ACDEP. So you have an ACDEP of 500, madadagdagan pa ng 250. So now your ACDEP is 750. Carrying amount is 550. So 750 na yung, and then ito na itsura ng financial statement natin. Right? ACDEP of 750 and then carrying amount of 550. And then lastly, 250, naging ACDEP of 1,000 and 300. So what can you notice? Year 4 is the end of our useful life. And our ACDEP is equal to our depreciable amount. Ano yung depreciable amount natin kanina? 1,300 minus salvage cost of 300, 1,000. So yung ACDEP mo at the end of useful life is equal to your depreciable amount. And your carrying amount is equal to your residual value of 300. Right? So important things to note. So I'm just showing you the table format para you appreciate how it works talaga year on year. Now, when you're an expert, and then yung tinatanong sa inyo is, what is the carrying amount at year 3? What you can do is just go straight to it. How do you do that? You know that the annual depreciation expense is 250 per year. So since 3 years have passed, 1, 2, 3, times 3, you can confidently say that your ACDEP for that year is 750. So now I have 1,300 minus 750, 550. Ganun lang yung shortcut, right? So that's basically it for straight line depreciation. So some things to note lang. So this is how usually yung formula for this. So you start with your cost, you subtract your RV or residual value, you get your depreciable amount. And then depreciable amount divided by useful life is your annual depreciation for the year. And then madali lang to because hindi na putol yung year. In year 1, 12 months. So 250, 250, 250. So ang important thing to note here is that depreciation expense in straight line depreciation, most of the time, pare-pareho lang yung annual depreciation expense, right? And then at the end of the useful life, again, please take note of this. At the end of the useful life, to check kung tama yung pag-depreciate nyo, this 1,000 is equal to your depreciable amount and this 300 is equal to your residual value. So that sums up our straight line depreciation, right? Next. Now, there are other methods of depreciating. And the next one I'll talk about is declining balance. And the declining balance was actually brought about by the argument na it's weird. Parang items don't really depreciate consistently over the years. Honestly, some people argue that computers mas nagde-depreciate siya in year 1 because and then paunti-unti yung depreciation niya as the years go by. Na mas, kware, if you have an iPhone 12, ang pinakabagsak niya in price is a 1-year-old iPhone 12. Like, it's a difference of 20,000. But a year 2, if you compare a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, probably yung difference lang nila is 5,000. Because people argue na it's in the first year of usage or in the early years na mas nalalaspag yung equipment, right? And therefore, they said, no, straight line depreciation is not correct. We should have a declining balance. And the declining balance, instead of parang divide or finding an annual depreciation rate, what they first find is what they call a declining balance rate. Wherein, this is the formula. N, so be careful. If it's a declining balance of double declining, N is equal to 2. If 150%, N is equal to 1.5. If it's 250%, it's 2.5, etc., etc. But you have a multiplier of N. You multiply by 1 over the useful life. And usually that will give you a percentage. So usually it's around 50% or whatever. What you do is you get your DBR or declining balance rate, and then you multiply it by your current amount or your beginning current amount to get the depreciation expense for that year. So I will already show you the whole thing based on our example kanina. So again, wag malito. We started with the cost of 1,300. We had the residual value of 300 and you got the depreciable amount of 1,000. And then you have a useful life of 4 years. Now, honestly, yung depreciable amount will never be used in double declining. Again, depreciable amount will never be used or is never important in double declining. Last, depreciable amount, which is super important for us in straight line, will never be used in double declining. Ang importante sa atin in double declining is our DBR or our declining balance rate. And how do you do that? Since double declining, our N is equal to 2. 1 over the useful life of 4 years is 1 over 4. So honestly, if you compute that, that will be what? 2, 1 divided by 4, 25% times 2, you get 50%. So our DBR is 50%. Now, this is purchase, right? Ito yung purchase natin. So the carrying amount natin in the beginning is 1,300. We multiply the DBR of 50% to the carrying amount. So ang depreciation expense natin is 650 and our ACDEP is 650. Right? So again, we multiply our DBR to the carrying amount, not the depreciable amount. Wala tayong pake sa depreciable amount in double declining or any declining balance for that matter. So you get your carrying amount, which is the cost times 50. You get your depreciation expense. Kaya yung carrying amount mo is 650. And then in the next year, the beginning carrying amount is 650 times 50%. My depreciation expense is 325. So yung carrying amount ko at the end is 325. Now, the last thing is, yung 325, you expect, okay, di-multiply lang natin to get by the DBR of 50% to get our depreciation expense. So dapat depreciation expense natin for this year is 162.5. But bakit naging 25? Because in double declining, the second thing I want you to take note is, okay, you apply double declining, pero pag malapit na yung carrying amount mo to the salvage value, pare ito, 325, the salvage value is 300. For the next period, rather than applying a DBR percentage, we just have to make sure na we depreciate all the way lang to the carrying amount. So yung carrying amount na 325, we want it to go down lang only to 300. Therefore, our depreciation expense is 25 na lang. And then yung ACDEP mo will total 1,000. So at the end, regardless of the method, tinan nyo, at the end of the useful life, dapat at the end, yung act debt mo of 1,000 is equal to your depreciable amount of 1,000 and yung 300 na carrying amount at the end of the useful life is equal to your salvage value. So, to summarize, in double declining, we multiply the DBR to our cost of 1,300 without subtracting our RV at the first year. And then we apply the DBR to the updated beginning carrying amount. So, 650 to. So, in the next year, 650 times 50%. But, please remember, ito yung pinaka-important lang sa declining balance. In the last period, which in this case is 2023, we don't use the DBR to get the depreciation expense. Instead, we force the depreciation to give us the carrying amount at salvage value. So, again, to summarize, itong 325, malapit na siya sa 300. So, we just, at the end of the period, 300 minus 325. So, depreciation expense is 25. So, in double declining, as you can see, ang pinakamataas na depreciation expense would be in the first years. And then, as time goes by, bumababa si depreciation expense. So, in summary, there are two things you have to master for declining balance. Number one is to get your DBR, and then knowing na your DBR would be multiplied by your carrying amount. Right? Yeah. Okay. And then let's go to the last method. So the last method is that some would argue that it should be depreciated, not in terms of the year, like how long it is, but in terms of usage. So for example, bumili ako ng laptop. I use it every day, as in hindi ko shutdown laptop ko. Right? So every day, 24 hours ginagamit ko. Versus, like, my friend. Yung friend ko, hindi naman masyado mahilig sa laptop. Or, my sister. My sister never uses her laptop kasi busy siya sa duty. Right? She probably uses her laptop 1 hour a day. If we depreciate pareho, based on year, pareho lang yung carrying amount ng laptop ko sa carrying amount ng laptop niya. But some would argue, hindi ba mas dapat depreciated yung laptop ko? Kasi I use it for 24 hours while my sister only use it 1 hour per day. Parang mas bago pa rin technically yung laptop niya kahit 1-year-old sila pareho. Right? And therefore, the last depreciation method that we'll be sharing is units of activity. Wherein rather than treating it as useful life in terms of years, let's treat it as useful life in terms of units of activity. And therefore, we want to calculate depreciation expense per unit. So usually it's in hours or days. But kaya ko lang niligay na unit is because they can attach any unit of activity. But in essence, what you need to do for units of activity is you divide your depreciable amount by your units of activity to get your DPU or your depreciation expense per unit. And then each year, you look at the number of units of activity that you have, and then you multiply that by your DPU to get your depreciation expense, right? So again, same example. But instead of the useful life being 4 years, let's say the useful life of that laptop is 10,000 hours. So same way to calculate our depreciable amount at 1,000, but rather than dividing this by 4 years, we divide it by the total units of activity, which is 10,000 hours round. We will arrive with a DPU of $0.10 per hour of depreciation. So in DPU or in units of activity, ang importante each year is hindi naman how much time has passed, but how many hours you put in. So in year 1, 3,000 hours raw, 2,000 sa year 2, year 3, 4,000, and then year 4, 1,000. And then in total, if you add 3 plus 2 plus 4 plus 1, that's 10,000 hours. So how do you calculate depreciation expense? Basically, it's just what? DPU of 0.10 times 3,000 hours. So 300 yung DepX mo sa year 1. Let's go to year 2. DPU of 0.10 times the units for that year is 2,000. So 200. So ganun lang. And then because and then at the end pareho pa rin. Your depreciable amount at the end of the useful life will still be equal to your act debt, and yung 300 na carrying amount is equal to your residual value. Right? So every period, so again, 2 steps lang. We get our DPU or their depreciation expense per unit. And then every period, we multiply units of activity in DPU. So please, I urge you, master all three using the Valix chapters and the Wakan. But in essence, ito lang yung mga formulas. So we're done. Now let's master. And in mastering, I will show you another complication. So before you move on to this part, please pause the video and then please get nyo dapat how I arrive with the different tables for straight line, double declining, and units of activity. Please, don't proceed pag hindi nyo pa-gets. Kasi malilito kayo in this example. Now, bakit mahirap tong example na to? Because they bought the equipment mid-year. And ito talaga yung papatay sa inyo sa PPE exercises and problems. Kapag mid-year, hindi siya parang annual before na parang manlinis. Meron kang i-proper rate, particularly for straight line depreciation and declining balance. And when that happens, don't panic. Kailangan gets yung muna yung kanina natin pinag-usapan. Now, pag mid-year purchase, this is how you solve for it, right? So please, master first yung malinis na year and then go to mid-year. That's the second iteration that you have to master. So, may given, they were bought in October 1. And then may iba-ibang depreciation. So let's look at this problem from straight line depreciation. So empty to. But what I know or what was given in the problem were 4 things. The cost of that equipment was 120,000. Second, the residual value is 12,000. And then, its useful life is in 4 years. And then, it was bought in October 1. Now, for me, para hindi kayo malito, I want you to understand na, okay, may mid-year purchase. Meaning, I bought in October 2020. So now, it will probably, so kailangan ko malaman yung depreciation for 2020, which is from October to December. And then, at the last year, kailangan ko rin malaman yung butas na from January 2024 all the way until yung October or September 30 of that year. So wag kayo magpanic. What I suggest is you count the number of months in the first year during that mid-year. So ilang months na lang to December? October, November, December. Right? So 3 months. October, November, December. Next, alam natin na ultimately 4 years naman yan. So, in the last year, yung botal nyo would be 9 months worth. Kasi 12 months minus 3 months, may 9 months kang matitira. Right? So, I hope gets nyo yung sa first year, may 3 months na nakahang. And then at the last year, may 9 months na nakahang. Why? The 3 months in the first year, I'm talking about the months of October, November, and December 2020. The last year, I'm talking about 2024, January 1, all the way to September 30, right? So, may 3 months na nakahang at the start, may 9 months na nakahang. But when you add them together, technically, that's still 1 year, right? So, with that mindset, let's now solve for the annual depreciation muna. We know that the DA is 108,000 because that's 120 minus 12. So, depreciable amount is 108. Our useful life is 4 years. So our annual depreciation is 27,000. So what I'm expecting is in 2021, in 2022, and 2023, 27,000 yung depreciation expense. Weird lang yung depreciation expense natin in October because that will just be 3 months worth of depreciation. And then in 2024, weird din siya because that's gonna be 9 months worth of depreciation. But whatever this is, 3 months plus 9 months dapat equal to 27,000. I hope that sinks in. Pero when we go through it, you'll get it more. Right? So, how do we go about it? Number 1, alam natin in 2020, 3 months lang siya worth of depreciation. Therefore, yung 27,000, hindi yan yung depreciation expense niya. It's really 27 times 3 over 12 or So 27,000 times 3 over 12 is 6,750. Right? So ito yung depreciation expense. So ang ACDEP natin would be ito, same. Our carrying amount therefore is 113,250. Right? And then, in the next years, malinis na. We expect an annual depreciation of 27,000 for the next 3 years. Right? 27 yearly, and then yung ACDEP natin tumataas. Right? Kasi 6,750 plus 27 naging 33,750. 33,750 plus 27 naging 67,50. 27 plus 6750 is 87,750. Right? So right now, our carrying amount is 32,250. Now, in the 2024, weird siya because 9 months na lang yung depreciation natin. And how do you get 9 months worth of depreciation? That's 27,000 annual plus times 9 over 12. So our depreciation expense is 20, 20, 50. So in the end, we will have an ACDEP of 108, which is equal to our depreciable amount, and 12,000, which is equal to our residual value. And then if you notice, yung 6,750 plus yung 20,250, when you add them together, 27,000. So in essence, pareho pa rin yung annual depreciation natin sa straight line. Nagkaroon lang ng weird depreciation expense in the first year and nagkaroon lang ng weird depreciation expense in the last year because mid-year yung purchase. But, pag ginawa niyo lang na, alam ko na 3 months and 9 months yung butal, you'll be able to understand na, okay, 27,000 yung depreciation expense every year except year 1 or the first year and last year. But the total should be 27,000 per year. And then you just prorate it depending on the month, right? So that's straight line. So honestly, yun lang naman yung pangpahirap pag mid-year. Be careful pag mid-year purchase tapos straight line depreciation. Kapag declining balance, yun pa yung kailangan yung ingatan. Right? Bakit? Because our DBR is also in an annual rate. So let's solve for our DBR. Our DBR is 50%. Right? Now, we expect na 50% yung DBR mo for the succeeding periods. But in the first year, there are only 3 months and our DBR is an annual rate. Therefore, we have to prorate it. So, same way, 50% times 3 over 12 what? You will get a DBR of 13% or 12.5%. So you multiply that by the carrying amount to get your depreciation expense of 15,000. You have an ACDEP of 15, and then your carrying amount is 105. And then, smooth sailing na tayo after that mid-year purchase. So ang nagpa-complicate lang is si October to December. 3 months worth. Kaya 50% annual DBR times 3 over 12. Kaya depreciation expense is 15,000 lang. And then ito, straight line na to. I mean, dire-diretso na. What's the carrying amount? 105. E di multiply lang natin yung DBR of 50 to get DepX of 52,500. Okay, ano yung carrying amount in the beginning? 52,500. We multiply the DBR at 50%. So yung DepX mo for that year is 26,250. Last, 26,250 times 50% DBR, depreciation expense of 13,000. So now, yung carrying amount natin is 13,125. Now, our RV is 12,000. So, malapit na sa residual value. So, instead of multiplying DBR, we want to make it equal to the salvage value. So, paano yun? Paano natin gagawing 12,000 si 13,125? Basically, 13,125 minus 12,000 is a depreciation expense of 1,125. So, ang total ACDEP natin, which is computed as 106,875 plus 1,125 108. So again, at the end, regardless of the method, at the end of the useful life, our act depth is equal of 108,000 is equal to the depreciable amount, and yung carrying amount is 12,000, which is equal to our residual value, right? So ingat, pag mid-year, ang papatay sa inyo is yung DBR rate at the first year and then yung weird depreciation expense sa straight line kanina, right? So please be careful lang about that. Walang effect sa end because in the end, regardless kung mid-year purchase, pino-force natin yung last depreciation expense so that we can bring out the salvage value and the carrying amount. So the last is units of activity, and si units of activity yung wala kang pakialam kung mid-year yung purchase. Because hindi siya time-based. It's activity-based, right? So let's say 12 hours raw yung total units of activity. So kung 12 hours and then ito yung mga given, then our depreciable amount should be divided by not by the time, but by the number of hours. So we have a $9 DPU. So basically, we just multiply 9 times 1.7 to get 15,300. Yun na yung depreciation expense natin, right? 9 times 1,700. 15,300. And then, ito yung up depth, ito yung carrying amount. 24,300 is just basically what? 27 hours times the DPU of $9 per hour, 24,300. So, ganun lang. We use the activity. And then, ultimately, our act depth would be what? The 12,000 hours times the DPU. Right? So, in total, 108,000 yung depth. So, in units of activity, yun yung wala kang pakialam kung mid-year yung purchase. Right? So, please be careful lang kung mid-year purchases, but in essence, the way to solve it still remains the same. So we're done with this. Now, the last complication for depreciation, and please bear with me, would be, what if a company changes its depreciation method during the useful life? And huwag kayong kabahan, because honestly, in terms of revision of periodic depreciation, 3 steps lang. Determine the carrying amount before the policy change, and then ano yung remaining useful life. And then from there, just solve as usual depending on what the change in policy is. So usually, you'll be asked to determine the new depreciable amount. So for simplicity's sake, yung change in policy is still straight line method. Meron lang silang change in estimates. So you have this problem wherein Vasquez SA shows equipment at 32,000 and accumulated depreciation at 9,000. The depreciation of ACDEP of 9,000 resulted from a straight line. So ito yung una nilang policy. Straight line method, useful life of 10,000, residual value of 2. But however, during a certain time, the company concluded that mali pala. They want to change the estimate. Yung useful life pala should be 7 years instead of 10 years. But pareho yung residual value. So, what would be the revised annual depreciation? And as an extra question, what will be the carrying amount of December 31, 2025? So, the first thing is let's determine the carrying amount and the remaining useful life. So, ang carrying amount natin is just basically what? 32,000 equipment minus ACDEP of 9,000. Ang carrying amount natin before the change is 23,000. So, super important to get the carrying amount. Right? 23,000. Next. But how many years have passed from the 10 years? Kasi right now may ACDEP tayo eh. So, parang a certain time has passed. Hindi natin alam how much. Right? So, now we have to solve how many years have passed to give us an ACDEP of 9,000. And in order to do that, we need to get our annual depreciation. So how do we do that? We have a cost of 32,000 less our residual value of 2,000. So our depreciable amount is 30,000. Now, our useful life before any change in estimate was 10. So now, 30,000 divided by 10, we know that our annual depreciation is 3,000. Right now, our ACDEP is at 9,000. So, we have to divide our ACDEP by the number of annual depreciation. So, our ACDEP right now is 9,000. We know that our annual depreciation expense is 3,000. 9,000 divided by 3,000, we know that 3 years have passed. So from 2020, 2020, 2021, 2022. It's 2020, January 2021. So it's December 31, 2022, right? So 2022. So 3 years have passed. So now, we have a revised useful life of 7 years minus the 3 years that have passed. So ang remaining life na lang is 4 years, right? So we're done with identifying remaining life. So before, the estimate, may 7 years pa to go. But binabaan ng 3 years yung estimate. So now, 4 na lang yung remaining life. So now, alam na natin lahat ng necessary info. The carrying amount is 23,000. Our remaining life is 4 years. So now, when you solve for the new annual depreciation, that would be 23,000, which is the carrying amount of 23,000. Our residual value is still 2,000. So now our depreciable amount is 21,000 and our useful life is 4 years. So 21,000 divided by 4 is 5,250. Right now is January 1, 2023 because 3 years have passed, right? 2020, 2021, 2022. So 2023 na ngayon, January 1, 2023. So if we're asking for ano yung carrying amount at December 31, 2025, may 3 years to go pa. Kasi that's 2023, 2024, and 2025. So 3 years. So now that we know that the annual depreciation is 5,250, the shortcut way of solving for it is 5,250 times how many years to December 31, 2025? 3 years. 2023, 2024, 2025. So our act debt is 15,750 because that's times 3. So our carrying amount of 23,000 minus the act debt of 15,750. Yun yung carrying amount natin at December 2025. So 7,250. So again, if it's confusing for you, please go back, rewind this portion. Kasi ito yung mga parang types of difficulty na you can expect in your PPE exam, in your quizzes. So kung hindi nyo to gets, please go back, ask questions on YouTube, ask questions on Facebook, or even ask questions during the exercise lecture in preparation for your Monday quiz, right? So last is sometimes companies would change estimates on their residual value. So ito yung other example na, okay, pareho yung useful life, pero ang iniba nila, estimate sa residual value. Well, ito, straightforward lang. Your cost is still carrying amount is 23,000, but our residual value is now 1,000. So our DA is 22,000. Useful life is now 7 years because 10 years pa rin, minus 3 years that have passed, so 7 years. So 22,000 divided by 7 is equal to 3,142. So again, when it comes to revision of periodic depreciation, it's just determine yung carrying amount and yung remaining useful life and then solve as is using the different methods. So finally, that ends depreciation. The last one, the last concept is sometimes you'll have one additional expenditures, right? So sometimes you'll have additional expenditures. And whenever you have additional expenditures, you just ask yourself, does the expenditure improve either the operating efficiency or the useful life of a property, plant, or equipment? If it merely maintains, that's an ordinary repair. And again, as you know, we expense ordinary repair. So yung journal entry here is debit, repair, maintenance, expense, credit, cash, or AP. But if your additional expenditure improves your operating efficiency or it improves the useful life, it will be considered as a capital expenditure. It will be capitalized. So again, if it improves operating efficiency, if it improves useful life, you add to your PPE. And therefore, yung entry here is debit PPE, credit cash, credit E. Right? So please master this. Walang exercise for this, pero I super expect you to understand. Sometimes baka mag-throw in kami na o tumaas pala yung value ng PPE because of a capital expenditure. So I'll leave it up to you. Please memorize this and please master this. Right? So last, disposal. So honestly, disposal, hindi naman siya mahirap. Kailangan master nyo lang yung process. And in essence, whenever you sell or you dispose of your PPEs, dalawa lang naman talaga kailangan yung gawin. Number one, you update the depreciation. So sometimes, magbebenta kayo mid-year. So please make sure na mag-depreciate muna kayo all the way. So correct. You have a depreciation expense from 2021 to 2023. And then mid-year 2024, na pag-decidean mo, bebenta ko to or re-retire ko to. Meron ka pang remaining months na hindi na-depreciate. So first step, every time may disposal, you update the depreciation from the fraction of that year. Right? So kare, nag-depreciate ako January 1. Okay, wala ka ng depreciation kasi noted na yun in the past year. But if it's February 1, may 1 month depreciation pang kailangan. If you sell it at July, may 6 months ka pa, right? So please, pag disposal, update depreciation. Second, you determine the gain or loss. And usually, the gain and loss naman is, if the disposal value is higher than the carrying amount of your PPE, that's a gain. If the disposal value is less than carrying amount, that's a loss. But later, I will show you na by just being systematic about journal entry, madali nyo naman palabasin kung gain or loss. Similarly to the other gains or loss na we had in cash or inventory or whatever, madali yan palabasin. Right? And in essence, may tatlo lang namang examples. How do you dispose of PPE? There are 3 ways. You retire it, meaning hindi mo na gagamitin. You sell it, meaning ibebenta mo for cash. Or you exchange it. Pare, may car ako, gusto kong bumili ng bagong car. Exchange ko na lang yung luma kong car and then that will serve as a discount. Then magbabayad na lang ako ng onting difference and then I'll receive the new car. Right? So, 3 scenarios. Right? So, you have your retirement, your sale, and your exchange. Punta muna tayo sa retirement. Ang madali sa retirement is if it's the item is fully depreciated. Meaning, if you retire an equipment that costs 44,000 and the accumulated depreciation is 44,000, your carrying amount is in essence 0. So your journal entry is just debit debt, credit PPE of 44,000. Pero, what if it's partially depreciated? What if instead of 44,000, meron ka pang carrying amount of 6,000? Because that's 44,000 minus 37,000 active. Paano mo i-journalize yun? Basically, you just credit the PPE at its cost of 44, debit active of 37, and then yung difference will be a loss on retirement. So again, madali lang to. First, write your PPE at 44,000, next debit the active at 37, and then hindi yan magbabalance. You have to balance. So you know that in order to balance, there is a debit of 6,000 na you need. Every time na either gain or loss, pag debit, that's a loss, that's an expense. Pag credit, that's a gain, that's a revenue, right? So since debit to, it's a loss on retirement at 6,000, right? So we're done with retirement. Retirement, either it's fully depreciated or partially depreciated. Pag partially depreciated, probably there's gonna be a loss on retirement, right? Next. The next is you sell via cash. So the same lang. If the proceeds of the cash is higher than the carrying amount, then that's a gain. If the proceeds are less than the carrying amount, that's a loss. But in essence, there's a way for you to just determine. Kapag credit, gain yon. Kapag debit, loss. I'll show you using an example. Example 1, we have a sale that will probably give us a loss, right? So how do you do this? So step 1, we update the depreciation. So right now, the annual depreciation of the equipment is 6,400. And on September 30, we sell it for cash. Now, meron pa tayong January to September depreciation. So how many months yon? January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September. There is 9 months of depreciation now we have to update. So therefore, it's 6,400 times 9 over 12. We have a depreciation of 4,000. We have a depreciation of what? 4,800. Let's just update, right? So again, ang pinaka-important is bago ka magbenta and it's mid-year, make sure na you update your depreciation, right? Okay. Next, alam natin na ito yung itsura ng gain or loss. Ang hindi lang natin alam if it's a gain or a loss. But in order to flesh it out, this is the process on how you should journalize. First is you credit your PPE at its original cost. Kasi every time, regardless of gain or loss, we have to de-recognize it naman at cost. So hanapin ko yun. What's the cost of my PPE? The original cost is 72,000. So I know automatic credit PPE of 72,000. Next, you receive cash. So alam natin na debit cash. Magkano yung cash? 20,000. So debit 20,000. Next, you have a debt of 42,000 plus the 48. So 42,000 plus the 48 na you just recognized. Huwag niyong kakalimutan yung plus 48 or yung update, ha? So 42,000 plus 4,800 is you have an debt of 46,800. So meron kang butas. If you add the debits and the credits, 20 plus 46.8 is 66.8. So may missing na 5,200 na debit. So since debit to, we know automatic na loss on disposal siya at 5,000. Gets? So step 1, update depreciation. And then step 2, recognize gain or loss. Then please follow this procedure. Credit yung PPE at original cost, debit cash at the proceeds, debit the accumulated depreciation. Please make sure it's updated. 42,000 plus 4,800. And then kung ano yung butas, if it's a debit, then that's a loss on disposal. If it's a credit, it's a gain on disposal. Right? So same scenario pero may nag-iba lang. Nag-iba is yung how much we sold it for. So same, update the depreciation. And then, ano ulit yung formula natin? Ito yung journal entry. First step, credit your PPA at original cost, 72,000. Debit cash proceeds, 28,000 pala. Debt, debit ulit, 42,000 plus 48, 46,800. Now, saan yung kulang? Sa debit or sa credit? Now, ang may kulang is 2,800 worth of credit. And therefore, our journal entry would be gain on disposal, 2,800. So please, discard lang. Please make sure you get why or paano isolve for loss or gain on disposal. Maraming short problems na sure lalabas to. So ito yung mga madaling isolve versus yung mga depreciation. So gain or loss, please make sure that's a sure point for us. Last is exchange. So ito yung pinakamahirap when it comes to disposal. And honestly, ang kailangan lang naman natin dito is to be able to get the cost of the new PPE. Right? And the cost of the PPE is the fair value of the old PPE plus the cash paid. So ang idea here is that you have an old PPE, so luma. So I have an old car. I want to get a new car. Exchange tayo. I'll give you my old PPE alongside cash. And then you give me my new PPE. The first question is, what is the cost of your new PPE? And that is the fair value of the old PPE that I gave up plus the amount of cash na I gave. Right? And then, as usual, determine gain or loss. So, first step with the Cordero shipping, basically nag-exchange out tayo ng old delivery equipment with new delivery equipment. So, step 1, let's identify what is the cost of the new equipment. That's basically FB of old PPE, which is 19,000, plus the cash proceed na we paid, which is 5,000. So, the cost of our new PPE is 24,000, right? So, 24,000. And then, ito yung journal entry ng gain or loss. So, what are the 5? And let's do it in a chronological order para mapalabas natin kung gain or loss on exchange. Right? First is you debit the new PPE cost. So, alam natin 24,000. Next, you credit the cash proceed, which is the 5,000 ito. Right? 5,000. And then, we credit the old PPE at cost. So, it's 61,000. And then, debit the debt, which is 28,000. Right? So meron pa tayong butas of 14,000. And that is kulang of 14,000 debit. So pag debit, expense. Pag debit, loss. So therefore, it's a loss on disposal of 14,000. Next scenario. Paano kung the fair value pala was 37,200? So again, pag exchange, step 1, what's the cost of the new PPE? Fair value of gold, 37,200 plus cash proceed of 5,000. So the cost of the new PPE is 42,200. And then ito yung journal entry. How do you chronologically solve for this? First is debit the new PPE cost. So 42,200 dito nang galing. Credit the cash proceed 5,000 dito nang galing. And then credit the old PPE cost at 61,000. And debit the act debt of 28,000. So now ano yung butas? There's a 4,200 credit difference. Pag credit, revenue. Pag credit, gain on disposal. Therefore, gain on disposal. So basically that ends disposal when it comes to exchange. So importante lang is get the cost of your new PPE. So finally, in terms of analyzing the PPE in financial statements, the only thing that I want you to take note is PPE generally is a non-current asset and it's presented at net, right? So equipment is or PPE is at cost less act debt and the net PPE, right? So ito yung nakalagay na net. And then in your notes, ito yung parang mga sub-classifications, right? So in the end, this will end our first concept lecture. So I apologize. Today lang ako nagkaroon ng energy to record. I apologize for this. So rest assured, I will adjust accordingly. So your exercises will now be due Friday midnight. I will then upload the answer key Saturday morning, and then, kaya naman, when you have immediate feedback, alam niyo naman which ones you have to solve for. So if ever lang you want for appreciation, I'll post it on Saturday, right? So we'll have your second lecture. So I hope in the last few stretches, please prioritize your health. Mahirap magkasakit now, especially sa December. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. Last 2 live sessions for Zoom, and hopefully we end it strong para sa Christmas break, konting aral na lang. Then finally, patapos na 99.1. So thank you so much everyone, and I will officially end the recording. Right?